Hi everyone, I want to go ahead and make a video about high modernism. So let's get started. James Joyce. So he was born in Dublin, 1882 to 1941. He is Irish Catholic. He went to Catholic school. There's in the textbook, they talk a little bit about the financial difficulty that his family had, his father had, getting him through school. But he was college educated. He went to University College Dublin. He studied modern language. Um, and then when he graduated from college, he left Ireland, which is kind of surprising because all of his stories are about Ireland. He is kind of known as like the Dublin writer. And this was a big part of his technique, which we'll talk about. We'll talk about more. Okay, so Araby. This is the third story in Dubliners, which is his first published book, which is a book of short stories. The first three stories are from children's perspectives, and they're in first person. Um, and the rest, and then it goes into young adult and then into older adult. So it's kind of very intentional based on kind of age and things like that. Araby's interesting, and I think its placement in the book is interesting. It's the third of the stories. And it's a coming of age story, right? This boy is, he has a crush, and so that's kind of what I would typically think of when I think of coming of age. But also he has this sort of soul-crushing epiphany where he realizes, where he recognizes the futility of his personal life and maybe life. So anyway, modernism. Am I right? Okay. So Joyce had to really fight to get this book published. I think it was accepted in 1905, and then he had to work for years, like a decade almost, getting this actually to print. And a lot of publishers just were taking out passages they didn't like. They did not want to publish the dashes for his quotes. So if you notice in the story, he uses dashes to introduce quotes instead of quotation marks. They did not do that. They just used quotation marks. They're like, no, sorry, sorry, James. And so um, some of the choices have been changed. Now I think we accept that James Joyce knew what he was doing. He was doing that on purpose. And so yeah, and later on he would actually have more issues with things like publishing and people thinking his work was profane or inappropriate. Eventually Ulysses, which is kind of his one of the best, one of the most famous books that we have in English literature, considered a masterpiece. And anyway, he that book was part of a major Supreme Court decision in America, actually. It was banned in the UK for profanity, and then it was banned in America, and then it was challenged at the Supreme Court, and they actually they didn't allow the ban. It's kind of a famous book banning case. And then the ban was lifted in the UK. Okay, so even though I think Araby, this is a YA story, young adult, coming of age, um, not YA in terms of the audience, but okay. Anyway, but I think it's important to recognize that even though this is maybe one of the more accessible works that we'll read this semester, and definitely this unit, that James Joyce was highly intentional and that there's a lot more going on in the story than meets the eye. And so, I just want to sit back and relax reading this story. It's like, oh, he has a crush, and but if you do that, then you might miss some of these details. So, like Mrs. Dalloway, the psychological novel, Araby is going to also have, this internal conflict at its center. And that's how most of James Joyce's work is going to be, right? Where the conflict is mostly coming from within the narrator, within the protagonist. And so what we're talking about here then is this idea of an epiphany. And so at the very, very end of this story, we see that the protagonist has this moment of realization, excuse me, and he is devastated, right? He is completely disillusioned. He is recognizing the futility of his mission, recognizing the futility of his life. He is just absolutely kind of crushed. And there's a lot of talk about, well, I guess I'm going to get to this in a second, but there's a lot of talk about how, too, this might be religious. And there's people who've talked about how the emptying of the bazaar at the end of the night is like the emptying of the church. So, there's kind of a lot of commentary that James Joyce has done that makes people speculate about little choices that he makes within the story. Um, and I'm very curious to see what y'all think. So Araby, like most of the stories in this collection, is going to end without much resolution. Joyce, he is kind of famously one of the real pioneers of this method of this sort of psychological literature where the action is taking place kind of in the mind of the main character. Um, and it's really them having a realization that moves the story forward. And so he's really breaking up this like Freytag's, pyramid or triangle. He is breaking up this classical plot structure where we have this rising action to a climax and resolution. Joyce is like, I'm sorry, no. He is going to break that. He's going to break that up. He's going to do what he wants to do with it. And again, I think the goal here is maybe more realism. Life maybe isn't shaped like a story, like this traditional story that we like that's very satisfying. Joyce is like, this isn't supposed to be satisfying. This is about the futility of life. So um so you might feel that way, right? We might really relate at the end of the story when we realize, oh, we're not going to get an ending. Um, I do want to add to, like I was saying, we have all this idea of Joyce's meaning, and the way that people have analyzed what the story might be saying beyond kind of the surface details. So Joyce is Catholic. He's part of the Irish majority during Irish nationalism, kind of the peak of Irish nationalism. And so we can see, Araby is an accessible story, but it's also a representative story of a lot of Joyce's techniques, and especially within Dubliners, like his earlier works. One of the details that I thought was really interesting that I wanted to share with you that I was reading about in a footnote is that Joyce intentionally makes all of the children. So the first three stories in Dubliners is from children's perspectives and in first person. In all three of those stories, they don't live with their parents, they live with an aunt and uncle. And, to me, that doesn't, people, that's how a lot of people live, right? It doesn't necessarily mean anything. But Joyce was doing that intentionally to draw attention to isolation within society and the fact that the quote here is a lack of proper relation between consubstantial in the flesh parents and children, right? And so kind of this like broken family, isolation, you're not close to people. It's supposed to represent something, it's supposed to mean something. And so all of these little details, I think, mean a lot more probably in context. So if you're interested in Dubliners, the story from this, we read Araby, it's short, it's accessible. The one that a lot of people talk about is actually the last story that he added later in life called The Dead. It's longer. It might be a good one to compare. And it shows a little bit more of his later in life philosophy and the way that he thought about some of these same themes. Another thing that we can think about with Araby is this idea that Joyce had of holding up a mirror to Irish people, is one way that he described it through this naturalism that he's using. He has a very realistic depiction of Dublin. He's not romanticizing, right? And he's also, not making things look, I'm guessing, like much worse than they are. I guess I don't know. But she's trying to represent something very real. And the idea here, he says, is to hold up a mirror to society, to these people, to break them out of their paralysis. And so he has this idea that the Irish people are, paralyzed. I don't love this. I don't love this way of thinking about it or phrasing it particularly, but this is a way that he has of describing it, and specifically related to things like Catholicism and Irish nationalism. He had radical ideas about those, and he was even, suffered some consequences because of those ideas, especially when he was, writing in college and things. And he kind of self-exiled potentially because of that. He felt kind of isolated and different. And so he actually lived most of his life on the European continent, right? And so it's just funny that he wrote so much about Ireland. He's known as this, the Dublin writer. He lived in Europe. And yeah, part of that because maybe he felt like he didn't really fit in because of his radical ideas. Okay. T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot is, I think, tough for me. So he's born in 1888 to 1965, born in St. Louis, Missouri, which I'm from Missouri. It's just wild to me that he's from Missouri. Not a lot of people are. And it's funny because I remember when I learned that in college, I felt kind of cheated because we had to learn about T.S. Eliot in American literature, but then we also had to learn about him in British literature. And I was trying to figure out, I'm sorry, I already had to learn about him in American lit. Now I have to learn about him in British lit. But the idea here is that, he was born in America. His family is actually from New England, but he was born in St. Louis. And that's where he lived for his childhood. They sent him to prep school in New England, and then he went to Harvard. So highly educated. When he's growing up, he's learning about classical and modern languages. Um, and then when he goes to Harvard, he's studying philosophy. He actually works to get his PhD in philosophy at Harvard, but he actually doesn't complete it because he doesn't do his oral defense of his dissertation, which is relatable. It's very difficult. I mean, not that I got mine from Harvard, but and then he's not doing it because he's lazy or anything, clearly, because he ends up going to Europe, and going to the Sorbonne and going to Oxford. And so he continues this work towards learning philosophy, right? Later in his life, he wins the Nobel Prize in Literature. So he was appreciated during his lifetime. People did recognize what he was capable of. But if we look at some of his earlier work, which we'll look at in a second, when Prufrock came out, people were like not necessarily sure what to do with it. It didn't really fit in. It was shocking, okay, which I think he loved. So if we look at his biography on nobelprize.org, I just think that this is kind of insightful, thinking about why his poetry is so difficult. He says, or it says of him, never compromising either with the public or indeed with language itself. He has followed his belief that poetry should aim at a representation of the complexities of modern civilization and language, and that such representation necessarily leads to difficult poetry. So he meant for it to be difficult, apparently, which I guess is better than if he had tried for it to be accessible and it was very difficult, because then he would at least he would have even failed at his intentions. He was trying to accomplish something. He had some sort of idea of what poetry should be like. And what I've read about him in some of the biographies I've been reading, researching, is that he thought that British poetry was kind of boring, stale. He didn't really think it was representative of how complex modern life was. And so this was his way of addressing that issue. He says in the Metaphysical Poets, which I think I quoted this in the discussion board, the poet must become more and more comprehensive, more elusive, more indirect in order to force, to dislocate, if necessary, language into his meaning. And so this is a very violent description of poetry, right? Maybe a little different from some of the stuff we've read before, but the idea here is that all of these illusions, all of the way that he's putting so much of literature and history and philosophy and religion into a text is a way of making it meaningful, right? Of breaking through. And so I don't know. I can understand that maybe he had some sort of intention. He was trying to accomplish something. Okay. The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. It begins with an epigraph. It's if I thought that my reply would be to one who would ever return to the world, this flame would stay without further movement. But since none has ever returned to life from this depth, if what I hear is true, I answer you without fear of infamy. So basically, what's happening here is in Dante's Inferno, Dante is speaking with someone who had a very evil life, and he has no problem telling Dante all about it because he's sure that Dante is never going to be able to tell anyone. He's never going to go back to Earth, back to the mortal realm and tell people. So this guy's not worried about it. It's an interesting way to start the poem, especially because this is basically just a poem from the viewpoint of like a middle-aged guy in the mortal realm, maybe at a party or something. It's not nearly as dramatic as this epigraph would suggest, but I think this epigraph gives us a lot to think about in terms of what does that mean about Prufrock, right? Other things to note in terms of form, this has stream of consciousness style, right? This is written just kind of as thoughts are happening, as Prufrock is taking in sensory details and information. It's just kind of being reported to us. One of the things that's disagreed about is whether or not this is an internal monologue or if Prufrock is actually speaking to someone. There's a listener of some sort. And there's kind of theories about who the listener might be, who the audience is of this poem. But regardless, it's stream of consciousness. Another detail is that it's fragmented, right? And so if you look in the textbook, there's going to be those sort of like asterisks separating sections. And I just wanted to point that out. This is something that T.S. Eliot was absolutely intending on doing, was breaking up his poems and doing sort of a, I don't know, like juxtaposition, multivocal. It's off-putting, it's disorienting, and he wants that to happen. Okay. Finally, there are a lot of allusions in this poem, not nearly as many as the next one that we're going to talk about. But we have Andrew Marvell's His Coy Mistress, which you might have read in previous British lit classes. We got some Shakespeare in here, Hamlet, Twelfth Night, Dante's Inferno, of course, and then we have the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So pretty familiar texts. He does also reference Hesiod's works and days, which is probably less familiar, but most of these are familiar enough that you might have even recognized them. So thinking about kind of the content or meaning of this poem, Prufrock is talking about his anxieties around aging, his masculinity, his sort of romantic and sexual desires. And he's very pessimistic, right? One of the things that he talks about, he talks about balding. And he talks about, he said he has this line about in the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. It's repeated a few times, right? And so one of the things that I've heard about this is that this is a reference to the statue of David. And so Prufrock is comparing himself to the statue of David, kind of this perfect idealized image of man, and saying, that's nothing like me, right? I'm hopeless. Now, before we can go and feel too sorry for Prufrock, though, we hear him referring to women, kind of the object of his desire. And the way he's describing them is so objectified that he's literally just describing body parts, and not necessarily in a very flattering way. He's talking about, for example, braceleted arms, arms that are braceleted and white and bare. But then he's like talking about how maybe they're too hairy, and it's like, okay, like, what is your deal, man? So, again, it's not a very sympathetic portrayal of this man. I don't want to jump ahead yet. One thing to note here is that if we look at the title of this poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, T.S. Eliot is trying to kind of, there's a little bit of an irony, not even playfulness, but almost like absurd. There's like a level of something being a little off here. And we can see it just from the title alone, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Prufrock, this is a very stodgy, non-romantic name, right? And so we have this juxtaposition even within the title of something that sounds promising and romantic, but then the subject is this kind of stodgy, middle-aged, pessimistic, anxious guy. Okay, let's move on. So that's his earliest poem, that's published in a major outlet in 1914. This is The Wasteland. This is his, sort of masterpiece. I say with a sigh. So we have an epigraph again. Okay, so he likes an epigraph. We're getting an introduction, giving us a little bit of a hint of what we're going to see here. And so this epigraph, I'm not going to read this one. It's on the slide. If you want to read it, but this is from a more obscure text, right? This is not Shakespeare or Dante. This is Petronius. And anyway, the reference here is to a person who had, oh, and I'm so sorry, I'm blanking all of a sudden, but she had led someone through Hades. Ugh, it's right there. Anyway, and then she asked Apollo for eternal life and was granted that. And she forgot to ask for eternal youth. And so she ends up shriveling up, and her, not just in body, but in mind. And so she's just kind of lost. She's aging and aging and aging with no end in sight. And so then when someone asks her what she wants in this epigraph quote, she says, "I want to die." So just in case we thought we were going to have a fun, uplifting poem to end this lecture, no. um, Next, we have something even worse, in my opinion, which is that he's dedicating this poem to Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound, anti-Semitic, fascist, ended up being a Nazi, and making propaganda for Nazis and fascists. So, not a good person at all. But unfortunately, worth mentioning because he is extremely influential to modernist literature. He was majorly editing Eliot's work. And he also knew Yeats and he connected them. And so there's just kind of like a lot of ways that Ezra Pound was meeting people, putting them in contact, getting works published. He was really important to getting Eliot published. He really believed in him. But anyway, and then, Eliot too, by the way, has used anti-Semitic language in his poetry. He is definitely a problematic poet. Okay, let's move on. More quotes from Eliot trying to explain what he's thinking. So he says, "Immature poets imitate, mature poets steal." This is from his work, Tradition and the Individual Talent. So I think that helps kind of thinking about what he is doing here. I mean, this poem is so elusive that it's almost hard to read it at all, for me at least, because a lot of these notes are Eliot's original notes, his footnotes. He wanted us to read those footnotes, and a lot of the advice I've seen about this poem is you just read the whole poem, don't look at the footnotes, and then you go back and you read the footnotes, and it helps give you a greater depth of understanding. I hope that strategy worked for you. For me, I can't help but feel like the footnotes are part of the poem, right? He wrote them when he published the poem. So some of them are added later by editors and things like that, for giving us annotations and more context, but a lot of them were Eliot's original notes. So for me, it's like, I can't not read them. Okay. It starts so fast. Like we already talked about the allusions, or I mean the epigraph, but we even have the first line of the poem, the first official line after the dedication, which is, "April is the cruelest month." If you love English lit, you might recognize this reference to April from the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. Right? "Wan that April with his sure suit," now the difference here is that in the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer is talking about April as being kind of spring and it's verdant and there's hope and there's plants growing. And with Eliot, we are talking about um this bleak, war-torn, cruel world. And so it is a subversion. Okay, we're going to see this again and again. Again, this is a very fragmented work, even more so than the last poem. This is also much longer, so there's a lot more opportunity for fragmentation. There's 5 sections. Each of the sections has a different title, so at least we have a little bit of a title to give us some sort of meaning. We can kind of understand what he might be going for. Although for me, I'm kind of like, oh my gosh, please, no more meaning. Just tell me, just give me a line. Okay. And so instead, I have a footnote to read for each of these section titles. But even within the poem itself, right, we have sort of outbursts, interjections, things like we have this ragtime song, "Oh, oh, oh, that Shakespearean rag, it's so elegant, so intelligent." Or we have the voice of the bartender, "Hurry up, please, it's time." It's disruptive, I mean, it is, and he's trying to make it be disruptive, right? I mean, there's sort of this multivocality, there's sort of um, this, well, I'm gonna get to that in a second. Okay, so let's get to that. One of the things that Eliot is trying to do with The Wasteland is he is trying to use this idea of the mythical method, and he's being very influenced by Joyce here. I really wanted to pair these two writers together because Joyce, I think, we might underestimate him. We might think he's very accessible after reading Araby. If you think that, go ahead and read, even just the first paragraph of Finnegan's Wake, right? Um, but T.S. Eliot and James Joyce, they're really he's really influenced by Joyce. One of the things that he's really influenced by is Ulysses is about Ulysses or Odysseus and his journey to Ithaca, right? So but he's making it about his journey through Dublin. In The Wasteland, this is actually about the quest for the Holy Grail. Okay, and so Eliot is he's trying to use this idea though that from Joyce of contemporaneity and antiquity kind of meshing, kind of clashing, juxtaposed, but also together. There's just kind of this kind of dynamic that he's interested in, and how the juxtaposition kind of shows sameness between these periods. Okay. And how they kind of add meaning to each other. So thinking of the Holy Grail, where this is coming from, Eliot's version of this story is from Jessie Weston's From Ritual to Romance, which I haven't read, but I've read discussion of like what it's about. And basically, the story here is that there's this wasteland caused by the Fisher King. And through greed and kind of his desires and things like that, he creates this wasteland. Then this knight is going to rescue the wasteland, to revive the king and restore fertility to the land. He has to go to a chapel perilous and to the chapel perilous, and he has to ask sort of ritual questions. And there's kind of an interesting thing here too about gender, because the questions is like you have to ask certain questions to the male and certain questions to the female, and there's something going on there. And if you read The Wasteland and you read a lot of these footnotes, we have definitely something going on here with gender and the way that he, I don't know exactly what he's trying to do with gender, but he's saying something, right? There's different theories about what that may be. So this is just something I wanted to point out to you. Now, look, The Wasteland has a lot of interpretation behind it. We don't have time to get into everything. You don't need to know everything for this class, that's for sure. If you do want to learn more about this poem, though, if you're really drawn to this, or if you're just kind of curious, I would recommend Poetry Foundation's Poetry Guide. They don't have poetry guides for all poems. I wish they did. But this one I found to be pretty helpful in helping me understand what this poem is about. And so this might be worth checking out. All right, I hope you have a great week, and I'm looking forward to reading some more of these writers.